So I want to suggest that there are three main things that influence our thought, and this is pretty much universal, and I think many would agree that as far as our thinking and how we view the world, how we understand the world and our place in it, how we understand God and religion and morality, three main things: social influence, education, and language. And I'm going to only discuss two of those, education and language, for you, and give you some examples of how they contribute to seeing things in a certain way that is so problematic as far as Islam is concerned. So when we think about education, there's two aspects that we're generally concerned about, especially in context of if you're a parent. As I mentioned, I have 3 boys. I'm thinking about their education. Right now they're under 5 years old, so soon we have to decide like what is going to be the educational path that they take. And there's two main considerations that we're making, my wife and myself, and I'm sure all parents make these considerations, that there's a social aspect and then there's a content aspect, right? And we typically think of things just in terms of the social context, meaning that, and my parents had these same considerations, because when they moved from Iran and settled in Houston, Texas, they were wondering, we've heard that public school is atrocious in terms of the kinds of things that kids do. And so do we want to put our child in that environment? And what will be the result of that? So that's the social context, because of students and teachers and the kinds of things that they may be into. And I'm sure that today it's even worse than it was when I was going to school. But I want to suggest that beyond the social context, there's also the content of what's being taught in schools. And so there's this atheist talking point, again, that I mentioned, that as people become more educated, they tend to be more atheist. They tend to leave organized religion. And so that the implication is that to be religious is almost a form of stupidity and ignorance. And so this is a common atheist talking point. But the way that I like to think about it is that if you have an educational system that is built on secularism and atheism, if you put a child, a Muslim child, a Christian child, a Jewish child, in a system that is fundamentally secular in terms of what it teaches, then it's no surprise that after 12 years or 16 years or more, someone going through that is going to come out as a secular person, or even an atheist. And think about it, like if we had Muslim institutions and Muslim primary school, and we put a Christian or a Jew or even an atheist child in that system, and they were to go through 12 years of an Islamic education, more likely than not, and I'm talking about quality education here, more likely than not, after that 12 years or more, they're going to be Muslim. Like, we wouldn't be surprised by that, right? So why are we surprised, or why is it something that we're not aware of, that if we're putting our kids in schools that are secular, and the curriculum is based on a secular worldview, why are we surprised by the results of that? And again, this goes back to the environment, the ethos that we are drowning in, and education is a big part of that. So we have to think about not only the social context, but we have to think about the content of what is being taught. And this is the problem that I have. My wife and I have done a lot of research on this topic, and what we find is that, there are some very good Islamic schools, but the vast majority of them take a traditional American curriculum and they just add a couple of courses on Arabic or maybe Islam as a religion, and then that's Islamic school. It's not really a fundamental re-envisioning of what Islamic education is supposed to be about. It's just window dressing, essentially. And so you're not going to get significant results by putting your children in that kind of educational structure. And I think that as Muslims, this is a problem that is very important that we have to address if we're going to stem this tide of attrition, which this whole talk is about. We need to, I mean, one simple point is that research today shows, scientific research has shown that memorization and memory is such a crucial, important part of cognitive function and cognitive ability. Meaning that the more memory capacity that someone has, the greater their ability to think critically, to think abstractly, to synthesize thoughts. It all comes down to memory. But memorization is something that modern education, Western education, has completely dissolved. And it's almost it's like an insult to say that, oh, you went to school and all you learned was, you just memorized Quran, or you just wrote memorization. Like, that's not true education. That's something mindless. And these are the kinds of assumptions or the kinds of characterization that people give of memorization. But the reality is that memorization is a crucial part, especially at a young age, when children spend time memorizing and developing that ability to memorize in their what's called working memory. That yields significant benefits later in life in terms of cognitive ability. So look at our tradition. Look at the Islamic tradition and what education looked like. And even to some extent today, in parts of Africa, in Egypt, in certain Muslim countries, memorization is still very important. And in the traditional madrasa system, or in Turkey, they still continue this tradition of memorization. Memorizing Quran is priority #1 for children. And if we look at the geniuses and the caliber of intellect that our tradition has seen Islamically, we're not producing that, unfortunately, today. Or if we are, in a fraction of the numbers of what we were historically. So this is a great loss. And what is the cause of that? Look at the differences in education. So education is one aspect in terms of what is influencing modern thought. And the second point that I want to make is on language, right? So language also has a significant impact on the way that we think. And this is kind of it's a seemingly simple and obvious point. We kind of understand, yeah, of course, whatever language that you speak is going to affect your thinking. So, if you speak French, maybe, that you start thinking more stylishly, more chic. Or if you speak Egyptian, you might start thinking it's a good idea to have beans for breakfast. So stereotypes aside, there is this influence of language on thought. And in our tradition, the classical scholars understand this very well. And the proof of this is that they were very focused on preserving the Arabic language. They were very focused on preserving the Arabic language. And why was this? Because they knew that if the language of the Quran, if the understanding of the language of the Quran was lost, then the mindset that comes with that language would also be lost. If the language of the Quran, if the language of Islam was lost, then the mindset that comes with that language would also be lost. And if that mindset was lost, then the Quran would not be understood properly. The Sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ, his words, his narrations, would not be understood properly. The religion itself would not be understood properly. So arguably, without Arabic, there would be no Islam. Right? That's the implication, and this is what the classical scholars understood. And so language was so important. And modern cognitive science also bears this out. Right? And there's been research on the effect of language and differences in language amongst cultures on thinking. And these are some very interesting studies that I'll just try to summarize a couple of them for you. So one example is with gender. So certain languages gender nouns, right? Spanish, for example. There's masculine and feminine nouns. Arabic, of course. German, of course, genders language. And so they did an experiment where they took a word, for example, like a house key. And in Spanish, that's a feminine noun. In German, it's masculine. And so they asked the Spanish speakers to characterize a house key. And those subjects would typically describe the key as using terms like lovely, delicate, dainty, lovely, beautiful, to describe a key, you know, the kind of metal key. And they asked Germans the same question: how do you describe a key? And they used, and in German, it's a masculine noun. So they would use words like rugged, jagged, metal, sharp, these kinds of stereotypically masculine words, right? And so the difference in language, just the point of grammar, of gender, affected how they viewed, you know, basic objects. So that's a very simple example. Another example is perception of color. So the colors that we have in English are not shared across all languages. Some languages don't distinguish between green and blue, right? So if I show you a green card and a blue card in front of me, and I say, okay, what are these two colors? You'll easily be able to distinguish. But in speakers of other languages that don't have that difference, they don't perceive a difference between those two colors, right? And there's, you know, there's an example of this even in English where, say, like lipstick color, okay, there's so many gradations of lipstick color, and for some reason women seem to be more in tune to the differences of gradation in those kinds of colors, like 100 different versions of red. And they all look like red to me, but they're able to distinguish that. And so again, that's how language is affecting the mindset and thought. And a very interesting example, this is research coming from a cognitive scientist named Lira Varadovsky. And what she found is that there's a certain Aboriginal tribe in Australia. And whereas we use relative spatial terms to describe space, this tribe uses absolute spatial references. So if I asked you, you know, where is this podium in relation to myself, as English speakers, you'd say, well, it's in front of me, or to the right, or to the left, and you use these kinds of relative spatial terms. But this tribe would say, it's to the east of you, it's to the north of you. Even if they're sitting in this room where you can't see outside to have like any landscape where you're using as reference, they use cardinal directions to describe spatially their environment. And you know, that's a feature of their language. So of course that's going to affect the way that they think. And the researchers proved this by a simple experiment where they gave English speakers 10 photos. And the photos depicted a boy growing older and becoming a man. So there was like a chronological progression in these 10 photos. And they asked the English speaker, okay, order these however you want. And more likely than not, the English speakers would start with the boy on the left and progress to the man on the right. And Hebrew speakers or Arabic speakers would do the opposite. They'd start from the right with the young boy on the right and the old man on the left. And so they'd progress the opposite way. And so the researchers said that, oh, well, this has to do with the directionality of writing and script, because English is written left to right, Hebrew, Arabic, other languages right to left. But what about this tribe? How did they order the pictures? And this was interesting because at first there didn't seem to be any pattern to it at all. Sometimes it would be left to right, sometimes right to left. Sometimes it would be away from them, towards them, or starting from them, away from them, or diagonally. And so they didn't understand, like, why is this haphazard ordering of the photos? And then what they realized is that they were ordering them from west to east. And if you're standing here, like west, like just assuming west to east is this way, but if you're standing here, it'll be this way. Or if you're standing here, it'll be this way. And if you're standing here, it'll be this way. So depending on where the test subject was sitting and how they were positioned in the room, they would just, and it's not like they would go outside in the window and look at where the sun is and try to figure out where's north. No, they intuitively, just like we know like left and right, we don't have to think about it. Intuitively we know. In the same way, they have this understanding of the cardinal directions at all times, even in a closed office space or building. And so that's amazing, right? The way that such a small, relatively small feature of language can impact how one thinks and understand the world in a very tangible way is quite amazing to me. And so if we see this kind of difference between languages when it comes to these minutiae of grammar and language, then what about entire conceptual differences between languages? And so this is what I want to focus on for the rest of this talk is, this is where it gets a little abstract, so stay with me here, but the problem that Muslims have with language is that the Quranic language and the conceptual landscape that's implied by that language is vastly different from the conceptual language of the English-speaking modern world. And it's that conflict between conceptual landscapes that causes many of the problems and controversies that we see today. So this is what I'm proposing to you for your consideration and evaluation. So the differences in conceptual language, conceptual landscape, right? Because again, why would that be the case? Because there's different languages. Or the Quranic Arabic, the language of the Islamic tradition for 1400 years is different from English, or Spanish, or German, or modern Portuguese. There's substantive differences, and so those differences in language and concepts bubble up to differences in thought, differences in cognition and intellectualization, and that is a source of so much conflict and problems where we're not able to understand certain things that we read in the Quran, we're not able to contextualize them, and it leads to crises of faith and so forth. Yes?
So with this theory, wouldn't this then mean that people who speak Arabic or are born from that culture are maybe better Muslims, or kind of in a situation where they're retaining more Muslims, or I mean, are they like kryptonite when it comes to reading Islam? Are they?
No, absolutely not. Yeah, so this idea that if you speak Arabic, then that makes you a better Muslim. No, that's not what I'm saying, but I am saying that if you speak a Muslim language, you stand a better chance of resisting certain ideas that are toxic and problematic from an Islamic perspective and lead to the attrition rate that we're speaking of. And it's not like, it's not fatalistic that if you're an English speaker, English is my primary language. And for most of the Muslims in the United States, that's the case. And so if language determined everything, then it would be, our situation would be even more dire than it already is. But I think that we can translate certain things effectively. And this is what I'm trying, I'll hopefully be able to show you in a couple of examples I'm going to give. Hopefully I'm not going too far over time. Here. So these examples. Oh, and I also want to give you a little more of an example of this idea of conceptual landscape. And we see this in academia, especially in the West, is that when you're an academic, and obviously I went to graduate school, and you're learning a subject, and part of your success as a graduate student, or a student in general in the college system, is your ability to internalize certain concepts and certain conceptual schemes, right? And there are certain ideas and notions and words and terms that you take for granted, and you are supposed to be able to deploy in different concepts in the process of analysis and deconstruction and reading different texts and about different ideas and different thinkers. And if you think about it in those terms, that we need to imbibe a certain conceptual landscape in order to analyze Islam. So, for example, Islamic studies, as Islam is studied in Western nations, then we are assuming a certain conceptual language, and then we're asking, as is often done in Islamic studies, what is Islam? What is Islamic? How much does Islam respect minority rights? How much does Islam respect women's rights? To what extent does Islam accept freedom and equality and democracy? And so, but think about that a little bit more abstractly, is that in asking those questions, you're deploying certain concepts. Namely, what is a minority? What is freedom? What is democracy? What is power? What is authority? What is equality? These are the terms that any graduate student in the liberal arts will understand intuitively. Those concepts, however, are never in question. What's in question is Islam. What's in question is the Islamic conceptual universe. And that's what makes you a successful graduate student, is being able to deconstruct and analyze this Islamic conceptual universe in terms of the conceptual landscape that is taken for granted. And so my recommendation and my approach is that we need to turn the tables, in a sense. That we need to assume, as Muslims devotionally, we need to assume the Quranic conceptual landscape and interrogate the modern structures and the modern conceptual landscape in those terms. And if we do that and have that kind of prioritization in mind and exercise a little bit of skepticism and critique, that is going to, inshallah, help us to be able to live in the modern world successfully and constructively and peacefully in the current day. And so let me give you an example of how this can be done. So the term religion, right? Religion is a very important category. And do we have an Islamic term that corresponds to religion?
Deen.
Deen, okay, right. So deen, how does that compare and contrast, the concept of deen in the Islamic vocabulary with religion? And so when we think of religion, the typical examples, Christianity, Judaism, Islam, Hinduism, Buddhism, maybe atheism. But the Islamic conception of deen is much broader. Deen can be considered any set of moral commitments, beliefs about the world, beliefs about how the world works. So in a sense, scientific beliefs could be a deen. If someone is an atheist or a hardcore secularist who has beliefs about science and the way that the world works, they're not a scientist themselves. They read science books or popular science if they're interested in knowing about atoms and knowing about the solar system, but they have certain beliefs and commitments about the way the world works. They also have ethical commitments about what's right and wrong, how to treat other people. So all of these commitments, metaphysical, scientific, those would be considered a deen. That's how one goes through life with those commitments and acts accordingly. So, but that concept of deen is much broader than religion, right? And the way that we can, give a tangible example, like earlier the question was, well, what's the fastest growing religion? And I said, oh, well, people are not affiliated with any religion. They're going from religious affiliation to non-affiliation. So the concept of religion, if we question that, from an Islamic perspective, what's happening is that you're leaving one deen for another deen, right? Because even though you're not affiliated with Judaism, Christianity, Islam, you still have commitments. You might subscribe to a kind of liberal, secular, human rights ethic, or communist, or socialist, or what have you. But it's still a deen. It's still an ethic and still a worldview that you're subscribing to. So it's a transference from one deen to another, as opposed to religion to non-religion, right? So this is a completely different understanding that we as Muslims, applying the conceptual vocabulary, it's a different understanding of that dynamic. And then we can ask another question, and this, so is Americanism a religion? Right? And this has been suggested. There's a book by David Gelernter who's wrote a book called Americanism, right? That's the title of the book. Americanism, the Great Western Religion. And what he argues is that Americanism is also a religion. It's not Christianity, it's not Judaism. There are some essences of that in certain aspects, but it's a separate religion. And even people who are atheists, or or formally they don't have any religion, they're still, as Americans, subscribing consciously or unwittingly to this American religion. And even David Brooks is a conservative columnist for the New York Times, and he also uses this word Americanism. He calls it a civic religion. And the way he describes it is like when we look at the characteristic aspects of what a religion is, American culture fits the bill exactly, because as Americans, sharing moments of reverence, certain historical events are shared reverently. Americans perform, in a sense, rituals when it comes to Thanksgiving or the 4th of July, Memorial Day, singing the national anthem, the Pledge of Allegiance. These are rituals, prayers perhaps, even if we could conceive it in that way. Listening to certain speeches. There's a canon, there's an American canon that we hold in high regard as Americans. Sacred documents, the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution, and their founding fathers. So these are very parallel to a kind of Abrahamic understanding of religion with prophets, holy books, rituals, and so forth. And so, as David Brooks argues, we should consider Americanism as a religion. But then this is the useful part of doing this conceptual analysis and comparing religion to deen. Because if Americanism is a deen, then wouldn't we say there's also a French deen in France, or a British deen in the UK, or German, and so forth? And if we can agree to that, which I think you will, then what can we make of the idea of separation of church and state? Right? So this is a big deal. The separation of church and state is a highly regarded value. It's the gem of secularism, the idea that we separate the church from the state power. And when we look at Islamic history, when we look at the Quran, I mentioned the examples of the Anbiya, like Sulaiman and others, Dawood. They weren't practicing separation of church and state. The Prophet Muhammad wasn't practicing separation of church and state. The Khulafa al-Rashidun were not practicing this. And so this causes a problem. If you're growing up and you're going to 6th grade or 5th grade civics class and you're learning about this gem, this amazing thought that ushered in the civilized world, that we separate church and state, well, why is that not found in the Quran? Why is that concept not found in my religion? That's problematic for me as a student growing up and thinking, and the way that I'm thinking and understanding myself as a Muslim and my religion. But we have now the tools, because we did this conceptual analysis, we can break down the idea of separation of church and state, because we said that, no, Americanism is also a religion. It's not separated from the state, it is the state. Okay? And so forth for all of these other European secular countries that we see in the world. So this is the kind of problem solving that we can engage with to critically dissect these concepts that have proved themselves to be so problematic and difficult for Muslims, young and old. Another issue is faith. Okay, the word faith, the concept of faith. So what is the analog of that in Islamic terminology?
Iman.
Iman, yes. So is faith and Iman synonymous? We use it synonymously, right? But if you've thought about it, and I'm sure many of you have, it's not perfectly synonymous, right? Because Iman, or let's start with the concept of faith. So the way that faith is understood, and I'm not going to get into Christian theology, but it's been influenced by philosophers such as Kierkegaard. Soren Kierkegaard, for example, who argued that faith is something that happens when reason can take you no further. Because to believe in God, to believe in the unseen, you need evidence, but evidence is not forthcoming. So to take that step requires a leap to faith, a leap of faith. Beyond evidence and beyond reason, we need to accept God on faith, right? And this is a part of, admittedly unsophisticated, sometimes evangelical Christians will use this terminology, this language of leap of faith without necessarily invoking the nuance of Kierkegaard. Nonetheless, this idea of leap of faith is highly influential, and Muslims have been influenced by this idea as well. And I've talked to young Muslims and college Muslims when I was in college and thereafter, and they'll use this kind of language. They'll say that we don't have evidence for God, we believe, right? We have iman. We don't, it's beyond ratiocination. It's beyond our ability to arrive at that conclusion. We can't know for sure, but we believe. We have faith, right? So that's, and even articles by Muslims in the blogosphere have been published on advancing this line of thought. But again, we have to question faith, the idea of faith, and should we be using the word iman as a translation of faith? And obviously I don't think we should, because of course in the Islamic conceptual universe, we have to testify, right? When we say Ashhadu an la ilaha illallah, it's testification. We witness that there is no deity, there is no God except Allah, right? So it's a completely different epistemology. We have to have evidence, and we're told by Allah, look around you. You want evidence for God? Look around you. Look at the world. Look at the heavens and the earth. Look to the horizon. Look within your own selves, and you'll see ayat of Allah. You'll see the evidence that point to the existence of Allah. And this is something that is a part of our faith, and the entire Quranic language portrays and conveys this completely different epistemology about how we can know God and the truths of Islam and religion. And so to have iman is something very different than a leap of faith, right? And so if the problems that are caused because of that conceptual misalignment in the minds of Muslims and Muslim youth, we can address that. And we can remedy that by simply correcting the conceptual landscape, right? And adopting teaching a Quranic conceptual vocabulary and universe in order to assuage these difficulties. So how much time do we have? I don't want to talk your ears off more than I have.
To my judgment, we can go forever. But I don't know, or maybe 10 more minutes,
10 minutes,
and then question and answer would be good, I guess.
Okay, I'll just quickly go through one more example. Inshallah. Racism. So we talked about religion versus deen, faith versus iman. How about racism? And let me pose this question to you all. Would you say that someone like Bill Maher, I assume that you're familiar with Bill Maher. Is Bill Maher a Islamophobe or a racist? Who says yes?
He's an Islamophobe for sure.
Who says no? And everyone else is undecided. So, okay, would you say Sam Harris? Sam Harris is, okay, you say yes, he is an Islamophobe and a racist. Okay, so they vehemently deny this and say that no, we're not racists. We don't have a problem with Muslims. We have a problem with Islam. Our beef is with Islam as a set of ideas and a set of claims and a moral system. That is our critique. And this is what Sam Harris and people like Sam Harris, which is a prominent new atheist, says, so does Richard Dawkins, hopefully you're familiar with him, as well as Bill Maher. So here's a question for those of you who know Sirah. Is Abu Lahab, was he an Islamophobe and a racist? Or Abu Jahl, if you're familiar? Yes, they were racists, but they were all Arab, right? But they're racist. Okay, so what about Muslims then? Like, so if we want to employ, so what I'm trying to say to you, to cut to the chase, is that racism, again, there's a conceptual misalignment. Racism as it's understood and deployed in the current context, and even against, what I'm saying here is against, in a way, Muslim interests, because I think that Islamophobia as a concept is incoherent in many ways, or it's problematic for our own beliefs and for our own positions. And I mean, the concept of racism itself, there's a definition that the Prophet, peace be upon him, gave in a Sahih Hadith. And someone came and asked the Prophet ﷺ, O Messenger of Allah, is it tribalism? Okay, and I'll come back to this word, asabiya, tribalism. Is it tribalism if a man loves his people? And then the Prophet ﷺ responded, no, it's not. Rather, from the characteristics of tribalism is when a man helps his people to do dhulm. Okay? So it's not. So the word asabiya, I think, is the closest conceptual cognate to racism, asabiya, and it's maybe problematically translated as tribalism, but we'll just use that as a gloss. Tribalism, meaning that, so the way that the Prophet ﷺ defines it is that, no, it's natural, okay, that you have an affinity for your own people, right? And that's what we see in cultures throughout the world. It's pretty universal that you have an affinity. You like your own style of dress. You like your own kinds of cuisine. You like your own, kind of cultural artifacts. But that's not racism, according to the Prophet ﷺ. What's racist is if on the basis of your tribe and in preference to your tribal affiliation, you usurp the rights and you treat unjustly others. Okay? For example, on the basis of the color of their skin. And the Sirah, the Hadith, are replete with examples where the Prophet ﷺ has called out the kind of base racism of saying, oh, son of a black woman, that, some of the companions said and expressed that kind of racial animosity and tribalistic animosity, but the Prophet ﷺ corrected that, and he made very clear statements that this is exactly tribalism and this is ignorance. But that definition of racism is not the same as Islamophobia, right? Because he didn't say that the enemies of Islam, like Abu Jahl and Abu Lahab, he didn't say that they were, that their crime was asabiya. He didn't call them out in the same way that he called out certain companions who were invoking this kind of tribalistic affiliation. No, their crime was that they were fighting the Prophet ﷺ in Islam. That was their crime. That is the prime crime, right? And so think about it like this to make it as clear as possible. If there are people who can criticize Islam, again, as a concept, as a claim, Islam is a set of claims. If people can criticize that, well, I want to reserve the right to criticize Christianity. I want to reserve the right to, and when I say criticize, I mean intellectually, right? I want to reserve the right to criticize intellectually Judaism, Hinduism, right? Idol worship is something that I want to reserve the right to be able to, discuss and say, this is something that I don't agree with. It's wrong. In fact, because if that is off limits and if that is considered bigoted, intolerant, discriminatory, then the Quran is discriminatory. Then the Sunnah, the Prophet ﷺ was a bigot by that definition. So we need to be consistent, right? We can't be using words and concepts that will will be used to hang us later, right? So we should get away from this myopia and be careful not to deploy concepts in the conceptual landscape that can be used against us or can be used against Islam and can be used against the Quran and the Sunnah. That's the message, and that was the whole point of that example. So just to wrap it up, any questions before I move on from that?
About this particular thing?
Okay, then we'll wait till the end. So then, just a summary, to wrap it up, Muslims are leaving the faith in America in droves. There's a tidal wave of this attrition. It's a big problem. And a big part of that is we're immersed in this ocean which blinds us, which obstructs the truth, which conditions us to see Islam as backwards and morally deficient. And so we need to detox. Okay? We need to address what affects Muslim thought in the modern world. We need to restructure Muslim thought in the modern world. And the two areas that I focused on and discussed was education and language. Wasn't comprehensive, obviously. And so just 3 takeaways, practical, so that you have something other than just my blustering. So number 1, teach your kids, if you have kids, teach them a Muslim language. This is something that I see all the time, that you have parents who are from the Muslim world, and they speak fluently, or almost fluently, Turkish, or Urdu, Persian, Arabic, but they're hesitant, and they're not really willing to teach their kids that language. And that's a problem, because, again, the language affects thought, and these languages have a long tradition. Okay, have a long Muslim tradition. And imbued and embedded in those languages are plenty of Islamic concepts and Islamic values, just again, within the structure of the language itself. So if you want to give your kids a fighting chance, again, it's not a requirement, but if you already have at your disposal an entire Islamic language like Turkish, Persian, Urdu, Arabic, please don't deprive your children of that, right? Don't deprive your children, just a little bit of effort. And it's not as hard as it might seem. So to give you a personal example, I speak Persian that my parents taught me, and my wife is Egyptian. She speaks Egyptian Arabic. And all we did, and now alhamdulillah, our children, they speak both, right? And English. And how did that happen? Alhamdulillah, I just insisted on speaking only Persian to my kids. So I just only speak Persian to them. And my wife only speaks Egyptian Arabic. And we speak to each other, my wife and I, in English. But we refuse to respond to any questions in English. We just default back to the mother tongue. And that's all that was required. And they don't mix the languages. It's actually amazing because when there are certain cognates or there are certain words that are shared between Arabic and Persian. An example is kebab. Okay? Kebab. And so when my son will say to me, "Oh, can I have some more kebab?" And he'll use the kebab, like the Persian pronunciation of kebab. And I'll say, "Well, ask your mom." And then he'll turn to my wife and say, "Mama, can I have some kebab?" And he'll, like, the subtleties of pronunciation is just by default, it's automatic. And so, mashallah, Allah has created the minds of human beings and children in such a way that they can really absorb language. And these are 2 languages. And English is just by hearing. Like English is right now their weakest language, but I mean, not for long. Like, they're picking it up so fast, mashallah. And there's no effort to teach it. Just by hearing my wife and I speaking English to each other, they're able to pick that up. So that's my takeaway number 1. If you have an Islamic language at your disposal, and honestly, like any language, okay, because being bilingual is very hard to do later in life, or trilingual. Teach them language, especially if it's an Islamic language. Second takeaway is to think a little bit more deeply. Again, if you have kids or not, we need to think a little bit more deeply about education and reforming Islamic education. The current Islamic school model is, I think, has a lot of problems. I think everyone recognizes that it has a lot of problems. So we need to be a part of the solution. And there are different Islamic schools that are projects that have been started. There's one in Arizona. I think it's called the Arizona Cultural Academy, that is trying to envision Islamic education from the bottom up. And they're doing a lot of good work, and others are as well. So if you have an opportunity to be a part of that effort or contribute to that effort, please consider doing so. And then the third takeaway, the third practical advice that I can give you is to be more skeptical and to really be sensitive to this, what I term category misalignment. Okay, and so if, when you read something, whether it's in the course of studying in graduate school or college or wherever else, or in the news media, you read something, don't take concepts for granted. And if you want to understand if there's a misalignment between concepts, all you need to do is translate. So if the word, like a certain word is used, like, is democracy found in the Muslim world? Or can democracy survive in the Muslim world? Or secularism, or freedom, or equality, or whatever it may be, take that word and translate it into Arabic. See if a translation even exists. Sometimes it doesn't. Okay? But translate that word and then see if you can find it in the Quran, see if you can find it in the Sunnah, in the Hadith of the Prophet, see if you can find it in the scholarly tradition of Islam, see if that word or that concept exists in the Islamic conceptual universe. If it does, great, then you can do a compare and contrast and deconstruct and analyze, just like we did with religion versus deen, faith versus iman. And when you do that, just that very simple process and that simple exercise, it's an intellectual exercise, but it will help you a great deal. It will help you navigate a lot of the language and the discourse that, again, we're embedded in, and we're constantly being impinged on us. So that's my third takeaway, and I've used that in my life, alhamdulillah, and it saved me in a lot of occasions to be able to do a kind of category misalignment analysis like that.